Hello, beautiful people. Happy Black History Month. We had a formatting issue with this week, but that's okay. We wanted to get it up and going, so all the information is still there. Enjoy this Teacher Lady Speaks episode for parents and for educators, all about the Harlem Renaissance.
Hello, welcome back to the Teacher Lady Show. My name is Miss Erica and I'm the Teacher Lady, and I'm here to share with you this week all about the Harlem Renaissance. Now, every single week on the show we have a different topic, and this week's topic is going to be about the Harlem Renaissance. It was really this booming time period, not only for Black people but for people worldwide. Okay, so the point of this show here on the Teacher Lady Speaks is to educate you so that you can pass that information on to your littles, because the Harlem Renaissance is not something that should be lost. It's something that should be celebrated, and a lot of appreciation and gratitude should go towards those visual artists, those photographers, those dancers, those poets, and those activists during that time period. Now, this week on Monday, we started with 2 interactive read-alouds. The first book was Take a Picture of Me, and it was all about the portraits taken by the wonderful photographer James Van Der Zee, and that was written by Andrea Loney. These books heavily contribute to sharing and keeping the history of the Harlem Renaissance alive, and super valuable contributions. Now, on Wednesday, we had the Behind the Book reviews, where I let you know how you could utilize these books to have as a resource for your children so that they would be more educated and equipped around the Harlem Renaissance. And now today on Friday, we are wrapping it up in this episode of the Teacher Lady Speaks, a crash course in the marvelous era of the Harlem Renaissance. You ready? Let's grow. Defining the topic for a child. So if I had to describe the Harlem Renaissance to a child, I would say that there was a time period around 1910 to 1930 where Black America really boomed in terms of art and culture. Now, the Harlem Renaissance took place after something called the Great Migration, okay? And what that meant was technically slavery was over as we understood it. The Emancipation Proclamation had came, it had left, but the results of slavery were still catastrophic. People could not work because of the color of their skin. They couldn't feed their families. They had no real livelihood. So it was like technically you were free, but really you were still locked up in so many ways. And that's what really started this migration towards these northern states and western states for a better quality of life. Okay, now a bunch of Black people settled in Harlem at the time and really started what we now know as the Harlem Renaissance. This was an era where our arts got to live. Okay, now what do I mean by that? Well, for the longest, Black people and their contributions hadn't been recognized. So we would do something, we would create something, and it would be taken. It would be taken away, it would be snatched away. But this was a time where not only was our art recognized, it set almost the standard for the rest of the world. The music you listen to today can be dated back to that Harlem Renaissance era. Those portraits and those sculptures and all of these different forms of art, the movies that you watch, there were so many contributions because you had this community of people expressing their frustrations and their angers through art. The Harlem Renaissance really showed the power of art, okay? Now, in this episode, we're going to talk about the political influence and so much more, but if I was explaining it to a child, what I would say is it was a time of great revolution for not only the Black community, but for the world, because it was the first time where our art shined on a level that it always deserved to, but never really got to. Let's keep growing. Now we're going to take a little bit of a detour and dive into a history lesson. So, this is how the Great Migration led to the Harlem Renaissance. Between the years of 1916 to 1970, there was a movement of over 6 million Black Americans Now, they came from the South, and like I was saying earlier, they came over to the North, the Midwestern, and the Western cities, and there were so many reasons around that. Now, although racism still is all over the place, there were certain states where it was stronger. It was okay to be more overtly racist. Lynching at this time was crazy all over the place. And so the thought process was, we have to get somewhere that is safe. So people came looking for jobs. There was a lot of factory workers, especially after World War I. They came looking for better education for their family and safety and housing. And ultimately, they just came for a better quality of life. But what happened was something so special that nobody could have really thought of it beforehand. Because what happens when you put this group of amazing, artistic, creative individuals in one area after experiencing so much heartache is beauty. It's community. It really sets the stage when it comes to what we expect today in terms of good art. Now, why Harlem? Why do people come from all of these other states, Texas, Mississippi? Why they all come to Harlem? Well, for one, Harlem at the time had a lot of available housing, and so it was a place where real estate could have continued to grow. It was a place that people were able to live. There was housing available. Not every area actually had physical housing available. It was definitely a boom era in terms of Black professionals. This is artists and critical thinkers, community leaders and activists. And it brought over all of these Southern traditions in music, language, food, and faith. And so it really became this hub, okay, of all of this greatness from around the United States centered in one area. So this was a time period when thousands of Black writers, musicians, thinkers, dancers, sculptors, visual artists, painters, and so much more, they came together to create something that ended up being a cultural explosion. All right. Now, when they all came, this resulted in what we now know as the Harlem Renaissance, which took place between the 1920s and the early 1930s. Now, another thing that was really special about the Harlem Renaissance that we don't give as much credit to is that it defines Black people as individuals. So we were a collective, sure, but people got to really get their individual art into the world. It was a way to celebrate so many artists. You had Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, who were phenomenal writers. You had jazz, which still influences our music today. Now, jazz is what's called foundational music. What does that mean? That means if you start at jazz, you can get pop, you can get rock and roll, you can get rap, you can get hip hop. There is no genre of music you can't pull from starting at jazz. The instruments at that time, the saxophones, the trumpets, the pianos, and so much more heavily contribute to the music that we know of today. Even all of them, the NBA young boys and the Bruno Mars, all of these people, even if you don't know it, got a lot of their influences from jazz music. Jazz music heavily contributes to the beats we love, the instrumentals we love, the background songs we love. It had a powerful influence. And at this time, you had to be talented. Now, what does that mean? That means today you can have a whole lot of potential, and if you have the right equipment, you're good to go, right? If you got the AI computer and you got the auto tunes and all of these cool gadgets, you don't actually have to be able to have that same level of talent. Now, back then, when we had Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and these jazz players during the Harlem Renaissance, they blew from the soul. I mean, they were exhausted. You'll see pictures of them just sweating because they didn't have AC either, right? So it was a completely different time period. You're in this hot club. Everybody is having a good time, but they are singing and they're blowing from the soul. Jazz is one of those things. If you want to know if somebody is really a musician, tell them you want to hear jazz, because you cannot fake the funk when it comes to jazz. Either you got it or you don't got it, and jazz is gonna let you know. Now, at this time, we also had visual artists, we also had theater, and there was also a huge political influence. Now, I will say that the Harlem Renaissance contributed to a lot of the freedoms that we have today. It was the start of the civil rights movement. It is what launched into the civil rights movement. So many of the efforts that they tried to accomplish at the time in terms of politics fell short. those laws were not passed. The laws of protection were not passed in a way in which they wanted. But what happened was they laid the foundation, just like with music. There's so many categories that today we're able to enjoy, right? The music, the movies, the political freedoms, so on and so forth, that came from a foundation being laid by these talented and very brave individuals. Let's keep growing. Now, another powerful piece of the Harlem Renaissance is truly the visual arts. So this is going to be the painting, the sculptures, the illustrations, the drawn portraits, even finger painting, and so much more. Because these artists created bold, modern images centered on Black history, migration, and strength. Now, some of those key figures at the time included Aaron Douglas and Jacob Lawrence, and their style inspired so much of the arts we see today in terms of storytelling. And so what was powerful about the visual aspect of the Harlem Renaissance is, we read books every single week on this channel, right? And the books have illustrations to help you understand what's going on in the book. Now, they also have words. And so if you were to remove the words, those pictures, would they still be able to tell the same story? And that was the power of the visual artists at that time. Now, what was even more amazing was, unlike the competitiveness and some of the crab in the barrel mentality we have today, where we always have to be the one, there was some of that, because whenever you're in a situation of oppression and mistreatment, everybody is trying to kind of find their way, right? Everybody wants to be okay. At this time, there really was an understanding of community, even in the sense of competition. So you would look at somebody else's art and then you would go shade some more in your background, or you would go add in some more. It was a way for you to be artistically free and to add as much as you could in terms of details into your artwork. And so even the visual art that came out of this time period was able to tell a story and reminds us of what things look like during that time period. Let's keep growing. Perhaps arguably the most prevalent aspect of the Harlem Renaissance could be writing. Okay, so there was a lot of poetry that took place at the time. There was a lot of storytelling that took place at the time. And writing was powerful for multiple reasons. One, you have to remember, it wasn't that long ago before it was illegal, against the law, for Blacks to be able to read and write. There was laws that were in place, and you would be punished if it was found out that you figured out a way how to read and write. So to now be able to write, and to be able to write so beautifully and freely, to this day, we're able to read that work to get a good idea of where it was that we came from and where it is that we're looking to go in terms of being a community of people, okay? So these writers used poetry, they used novels, they used essays and plays, they did songwriting and so much more to really celebrate Black life, identity, and resistance. Now, one of the writers at the time, Langston Hughes, received a lot of backlash even from his own community. And the reason being is Langston Hughes wrote a lot about the experience at that time of being a Black man in this country, the hardships that were faced, the oppression, the discrimination, the hatred. And a lot of Black people didn't like that. Why? Well, think about it. Let's say that you're a girl. And even though there is a lot of hardships and mistreatment when it comes to being a girl, right? Even though that is very true, if you go read about it, it kind of feels weird. It kind of feels uncomfortable because people only want to see themselves in this very positive and bright way. Now, personally, I feel like Langston Hughes did an amazing job at giving us a picture, a snapshot of what was taking place at that time. Because the reality is that was the experience for a lot of Black men. Most Black men experienced great hardships and discriminations. They had to work 10 times as hard to receive just a piece of what other groups of people received, and it was difficult. And so he got to share that through his writing, and today we get to read that and really understand what it was that had to be overcome in order to have the life that we're able and afforded today. And so I personally really appreciate those contributions, but I also understand at this point to where so much of the Black Harlem Renaissance, which is just called Harlem Renaissance, but it was very Black. I understand why, especially during that period, it was so based in celebration. They were tired of the oppression and the mistreatment, and so there was a lot of joy. Oh, but it was also a time to speak out as well. And so that's Langston Hughes. You definitely want to look up his work and share that with your child, if appropriate. And then there was Zora Neale Hurston, who is known for her piece, Their Eyes Were Watching God. Very, very detailed writer. Now, Miss Zora is going to be able to write in a way that nothing else would be as descriptive. Most people look at something and they say white wall. Nope, not Zora. She's always going to find another way to speak her truth. There was Courtney Cullen, and there was so many more writers. And writing is one of those things that gets to be passed down from generation to generation, that we get to read to understand what took place and to understand how to prevent that from happening in the future. There was a huge focus when it came to writing on racial pride, everyday Black experiences, injustice, but also so much joy and Black celebration and just overall Black empowerment. Now, the next really heavy section of the Harlem Renaissance we touched on earlier, but that's going to be music. During this time period, this was a point to where jazz and blues music really took off and really inspired the world. So the music had a lot of heartbeat. I was kind of explaining it earlier, how people would have to sing from the soul. And at this time, you would be booed. If you were not good, if you were not practicing, if you did not have that talent, it wasn't just support for all. Not everybody got a participation trophy, okay? You had to really have it in order to be able to show it. And honestly, that was for everybody at this time during the Harlem Renaissance. They were very big on fashion and the way in which they presented themselves. Art in terms of their outfits was a huge part of their expression. All of it really came together. You had all these different accents because people migrated from these different places. It was just a really beautiful, beautiful time. And Bessie Smith was another huge contributor when it came to music during this time period. Let's keep growing. I also think that it's important that children understand that slavery, in the sense of kidnapping Africans, putting them in chains, forcing them to work under inhumane conditions, that was not that long ago, even today. That the Harlem Renaissance was not that long ago. And so I think the importance of explaining the timeline is crucial. So for example, for me, right, I have my mother, and then her mother was at one point enslaved. Now that's not like super far up the scale. And so I think a lot of the times today we try to move children away from the aftermath of slavery, and we try to explain it in a way that it was a million years ago, and it wasn't. Now, why is that important? It's important because our society needs to understand the current impact of the decision that was made not that long ago. You can't have something going for 400 plus years and then expect overnight all of those issues to be erased. And so it is important for children, Black, white, or otherwise, to understand those impacts because it is still relevant today. And so in terms of the Harlem Renaissance, slavery ended in 1865, technically. That technically is extremely important because if you have been enslaving people for over 400 years and then you wake up and you say, go ahead, where are they going to go? What do they have? What businesses do they have? What homes do they have? What do they have access to? You've removed it. You have created a system to where they still have to rely on you in order to be self-sufficient, which means they're not self-sufficient, right? And so the Harlem Renaissance really peaked in the 1920s. Now, from 1865 to 1920s, Black people were trying to figure out, what is it that we're going to do? What does this mean? And a lot of people, even though they were technically free, they still worked for the same people because, again, where are you going to go? And those wages were not livable wages without the dependence of white people, which is why those 55 to 65 years after slavery slavery ended and the Harlem Renaissance began and started booming, that was crucial, because now we don't have to rely on you in the same way. We about to go do our own thing and create our own music and our own stories and celebrate and build community and grow and develop housing and businesses. It was a way to show the world that Black people can thrive, that they can contribute something so major, just 50, a few years over 50 removed. Now, that's not that old. I know for a lot of children, they think 50 years old is old. That's until they turn 35 and they realize it ain't that bad, okay? And so getting them to understand that this had just taken place and the beauty that came out of it and how it impacts us today, for me, is it's the core of understanding the impact of the Harlem Renaissance. Let's keep growing. The Harlem Renaissance was one of the first large-scale cultural responses to that oppression, the oppression that took place right after slavery, okay? So in many ways, it was the grandchildren of enslaved people finally being heard, finally being seen, and respected amongst each other, because there is something extremely powerful about seeing a level of Black wealth. And I'm not just talking money. If you were raised to only think of Black people in shambles, poor, heartbroken, depressed, if that was your only visual when it came to Black people, to now experience this rich culture and to be actively building it with each other, because it's not like that first group just showed up and it was already popping, right? This is community gathering. This is people coming from different states to say, we are going to build up something new. We're going to do something great. And I believe that there's so much power in that. Now, I can speak to my personal experience as well. And obviously, I wasn't alive during this time, but I grew up in an area where there were other Black people, and all those Black people were doing bad. Everybody was broke in terms of money. People struggled to keep even their affordable housing, even though we were on, assisted living and assisted housing. The pests in the area were bad. It was a lot of police brutality and just all of these visuals, right, around Black people being less than and being mistreated. And I'm from a very diverse city. I'm from San Francisco, California. But specifically, Potrero Hill Projects at that time was a way to look around and say, dang, everybody Black is just, we having hardship. People are dying, being killed, sent to prison. Now, unconsciously, that plays a role in your thinking around who you are and who you're allowed to be and who you should be. It wasn't until I went off to college, I went to Dillard University, which is a historically Black university in New Orleans, Louisiana, that I was like, oh, it's not all of us. It's not all of us at all. There was a whole life of Black professionals and lawyers, doctors, artists. There are so many Black people who are wealthy. And I'm not just speaking in terms of money. For me, wealth is truly freedom. The ability to travel and speak and share your ideas. There was a beauty that I had not previously been exposed to living in that neighborhood in San Francisco, California. Okay. Then I went to Atlanta and it really showed me, because in Atlanta was a way to see so many Black professionals, nail techs, and just the list continues in terms of creativity and creating. And so that importance of travel, even for me, today, that impact was super important. So you can only imagine the grandchildren of those who were just enslaved now having that experience of coming together and seeing other Black professionals create and being a part of that creation. Let's keep growing. Now, there is a lot about the Harlem Renaissance that isn't often discussed. It truly did lay the foundation for the civil rights movement. It changed how Black Americans saw themselves. Now, it also changed how America and the world saw Black Americans because of the influence of that heart. Well, the heart too, but the influence of the art was undeniable. It's like you could hate somebody but they're so good at the thing that you can't not acknowledge that power and that beauty, okay? The Renaissance also truly proved that Black culture was not just about survival, but brilliance. Now I'm going to briefly speak about the political power and influence when it came to the Harlem Renaissance. So the Harlem Renaissance had political influence because it changed how Black people saw themselves and how the country was forced to see Black people. And art became this tool of power, voice, and ultimately resistance. Let's find out how. So for one, when you want to talk about resistance or just fighting back, you have to have community and unity. And the Harlem Renaissance truly created a strong Black identity and pride. So before the Harlem Renaissance, Black Americans were often portrayed through racist stereotypes. We were separated, we were trying to figure it out, but it was a way to come together for this beautiful creation of art and of voice and of activism. So the literature showed Black joy, intelligence, love, anger, and complexity. The visual arts inspired people and made us critically think about who we are and who we wanted to be. And the music was a way for joyful, soulful celebration. So how did this influence political aspects of our country and just the world in general? So the one is the art from the Harlem Renaissance reached where politics could not. So many Black Americans were blocked from voting, holding office, or being heard in traditional political spaces. At this time, it was very difficult to become a lawyer, a politician, a mayor, to have those resources because we were still so heavily being counted out. We were being threatened and we were being blocked from a lot of civil rights at this time. If you can't run for office, if you can't be on TV at the time speaking about your people and your beliefs, your art was a way to get that message across. So the poetry and the music, the visual arts, these were all ways to get that identity and those beliefs and those experiences out to the world without directly being a politician, because again, so many of us were blocked from those opportunities to be mayor or governor, so on and so forth. And so the art was able to spread the message that politics did not allow us to at that time. One of the things the Harlem Renaissance also did and did very clearly was challenge racist narratives. Because if you have all these stereotypes around Black people being lazy and, not being able to accomplish anything and all of these just really awful things that are being said, you had this clear example of none of those things being true. So really challenge those racist narratives. It allowed us to reclaim African heritage. It highlighted intellectual and artistic brilliance, and it showed Black life beyond trauma. Let's keep growing. Now, the last area I want to speak about in regards to politics is that it really fueled what we know now as the civil rights movement. So the Harlem Renaissance laid the emotional and cultural groundwork for future activism. It gave us ideas of self-worth, like Black power came out of that, cultural pride and identity, and resistance to segregation and overall mistreatment. It gave us the ability to storytell. For so long, everybody else was telling the story of the Black experience, and now we were able to share that story ourselves. And actually, the storytelling is what led into organizing as well as protest and the language that was used at that time. Leaders of the civil rights movement grew up reading, hearing, and seeing Harlem Renaissance, their art, those contributions, and those overall messages. So overall, the Harlem Renaissance had a huge political impact because you can't demand justice without first believing in yourself and your own value. And so it laid out what was possible. It showed what was possible. And thankfully it did, because today we have rights that we didn't have access to before, ultimately trickling down and coming up from the Harlem Renaissance. We have the ability to dress freely. We have the ability to use our voices and to speak up, to make music, and to have influences of music and art and culture. And so much of this came out that time period. I cannot push and articulate the value and the importance of the people from that time during the Harlem Renaissance. Worldwide, people got to see what happens when Black people unite. Okay, and of course a lot of people were scared because they didn't want Black people to unite. They didn't want them to understand their power and their beauty and their intelligence. So the Harlem Renaissance was this act of resistance, but so much beauty and so many beautiful contributors came out of that period. Some stayed anonymous. Some people put out art into the world that did not want to be named. And then there are those names that we get to know of and study today. But even the people who are not named, you think about it, right? You have a musician. Well, who's helping that musician? And who's setting up that stage? And who's creating the club that the musician can perform at? And who's the background dancers and singers? It really was so many people that you can't just run through a list, because there were no invisible jobs. Everybody's job was relevant. Everybody's job was to come together, to build and to create, to inspire and to influence. And they looked so good doing it. Let's keep growing. Now, there was a lot of crossover when it came to the Harlem Renaissance, and there was a lot of crossover between your art and activism. So, as I spoke about earlier, Langston Hughes wrote openly about racism and inequality. W.E.B. Du Bois used art and writing as racial advocacy. Publications became spaces for debate and organizing, and so somebody would put out a written article or news article or story or what have you, and now you would have a community gathering around that piece and how to get that information out into the world to make real change. And so again, I can go on, but I really want children and parents, as you're filtering this through, you can kind of pick and pull. I would love for children to understand that impact, because it was such a heavy one that often gets lost when it comes to our schools. So although the Harlem Renaissance had huge impact, there were things that they tried to do during that time as a community that were not successful. And so during the 1920s to 1930s, Jim Crow segregation laws stayed in place. And so there was a lot of action around trying to get those laws changed, and those stayed in place. Lynching was still legal at this time. So lynching is the process of hanging somebody, usually Black, from a rope on display. And so killing them publicly in order to, instill fear. And that was still legal, and there was still voting suppression. And so even though technically some of them should have been able to vote, the fear around voting polls, the extra tests that you had to take to be able to vote, all of that was still very, very real at that time period. And then of course there was housing discrimination, which was legal and widespread. So many people who owned apartments or houses or what have you would not rent to Black people, or they wouldn't rent to Black people at prices that were fair. So the Harlem Renaissance did not immediately dismantle racist law. Now, what did change incrementally and strategically was, one, the legal groundwork through the NAACP. So the Harlem Renaissance overlapped with early civil rights legal strategy, okay, especially through the NAACP. So Black intellectuals, writers, artists worked alongside legal activists. Publications helped fund and promote court challenges, and this period helped shift the strategy from protest alone to court-based challenges. Even though they didn't have as many lawyers as white people, because the access to education was so much harder for Blacks at this time, there were still some lawyers that came out of this period that really helped ultimately to make change happen. Let's keep growing. Now, the other thing that happened was there was early Supreme Court cracks in segregation. So often when you're trying to dismantle an entire system that had been active for hundreds and hundreds of years, it's going to take some chipping away before it can fully change. And so some important cases that happened during or shortly after this Harlem Renaissance era included Buchanan versus Warley in 1917. So this struck down laws enforcing racial segregation and housing ordinances. It still allowed for private discrimination, but it was a crack in the system. There was Missouri Gaines versus Canada in 1938, which is the end of the Renaissance era. And this forced states to provide equal graduate education for Black students. The case also directly paved the way for Brown versus Board of Education, which happened in 1954. Now, these weren't huge changes in the way that we didn't go from 0 to 100, but what it did was it started the process and let the world know we're fighting back. We're using your system to be able to do so. We're putting down lawsuits to say enough is enough. We deserve access to fair housing, fair education, and fair overall treatment and safety. There was also the expansion of Black political organizing. So while laws didn't shift quickly, institutions did strengthen. The growth of Black newspapers and journals, there was the increased NAACP membership, and there was more coordinated national advocacy. So strong organizations are what eventually changed those laws. Now, here are the laws that were changed because of the influence of the Harlem Renaissance. Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which led to school desegregation. So this was to say that Black people could now go to school with white people. And the importance behind that, is most public schools in this country are funded by taxes. Okay, that means whatever area you live in, there's more tax money coming in, depending on if you're in a more affluent area or not. There's more taxes coming in, and those taxes coming in contribute to the quality of schools. So what was happening was white students were going to schools with more resources, textbooks, safety, desk, educators who were there consistently, so on and so forth, while Black students continued to struggle and fall behind academically because they didn't have those same access to resources. So it was less about we need everybody to go to school together and more about we deserve to also have the same level of education and access to those resources because we also contribute our taxes, we also pay money, and so why is it that when it comes to our schools, nothing is as it should be? And so that was really the huge part in terms of Brown versus Board of Education. Now, there was also the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ultimately ended legal segregation. Again, there was some aftermath because laws themselves don't actually change anything. It is a society catching up to that law that actually makes the difference. There was a Voting Right Act of 1965, which protected Black voting rights. So as I was saying earlier, there was so much hatred around Black people voicing their concerns and going to vote, and a lot of intimidation tactics and tests that were taking place to see whether or not you could read to be able to even vote. And so all of that, legally was passed in 1965 in terms of making it illegal to do some of those practices. And then there was the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which banned housing discrimination. Let's keep growing. So what the Harlem Renaissance shows is that culture moves first and then laws follow later. So the Harlem Renaissance, it changed minds, it built pride, it strengthened institutions, it created belief in Black worth and leadership and wealth. And this belief made later legal victories possible. Now, I know that was a lot, and guess what? It just scratched the surface. Because again, it is very hard to articulate the overall impact, okay? I've studied history and I've studied sociology and I've studied how so many of these things are connected on a collegiate level. But even still, with all the studying and the research in the world, it is hard to truly conceptualize and understand that had this era not taken place, we would not have access to the life that we have today. Now, every single week on the Teacher Lady Speaks, we compare two states to understand what your child might be learning on the topic when it comes to school. I always give kind of the heads up or the advice to make sure that you understand that just because it's listed as part of the curriculum does not mean that your child is actually learning it. Why? Every child learns differently. Every educator is not matched well with the child that's receiving the information from the educator. And if there are underlying things that are going on with your child, they're hungry, they're tired, they're going through a state of depression, whatever that teacher is talking about might not land. So if it is important to you, you want to make sure that you take initiative in being able to teach that information to your child. So starting off strong with the state of California's curriculum. So California curriculum alignment. California embeds African American history and the Harlem Renaissance in both history and social science standards. There's also some Harlem Renaissance discussion within the ethnic studies model curriculum. So these key standards are going to start at grade 3. And those include students being able to study people who make a difference and how communities are influenced by cultural and artistic contributions. So not directly Harlem Renaissance, but we're getting there. In grades 5, students learn about African American history, resistance, and cultural expression. Again, not anything yet specific to Harlem Renaissance. And then in grade 8, students analyze social, cultural, and political changes in America, including migrations that set the stage for the Harlem Renaissance. Now, in high school, which to me is way too late, under the U.S. History Standard 11.5, students examine the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 1930s and the new African American cultural identity. California also highlights the Harlem Renaissance in its visual and performing arts standards, emphasizing how art reflects culture and identity. So overall, in the state of California, it's a lot of dancing around the Harlem Renaissance itself, but there is actually very little that explicitly touch on the Harlem Renaissance. Now, underneath that ethnic studies, when they get to high school, there is a short period, but again, most of the standards relate to the topics of Harlem Renaissance, like how cultural identity impacts history and things like that, but again, not as much details as I would like in terms of teaching children about that impact. Now, let's move on to the state of Texas. In terms of Texas curriculum alignment, Texas includes the Harlem Renaissance explicitly in the social studies standards, okay? Now, this is going to start off in 5th grade. So, in 5th grade, students are required to learn about the Harlem Renaissance and its impact on American culture. In 7th grade, students analyze cultural, artistic, and economic developments that shaped American history, but not necessarily explicitly the Harlem Renaissance. And then in high school, students in Texas are expected to know that the Harlem Renaissance included the contributions of notable artists and writers such as Langston Hughes. You will often hear the same few names, but I always encourage educators to dig deep, look for those artists and those activists and those people that are not often named, okay? Now, under fine arts in Texas, it is also encouraged that students explore how art reflects diverse cultures and historical periods. Texas requires that students study the Harlem Renaissance as a transformative moment in African American and American history. So Texas actually has more embedded in their curriculum in comparison to California when it comes to understanding the global impact of the Harlem Renaissance. Still, I would say both states fall short in terms of really getting children to know that impact, because it is extremely important. All right, let's move on to resources. Here's some resources that if you really wanted to dig deep in terms of understanding the Harlem Renaissance and its impact, here we go. The first, you're going to have to get on a plane depending on where you are, but the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture extensively covers the Harlem Renaissance, a pivotal era, between the 1920s and the 1930s of Black cultural explosion in arts, literature, and music. So that exhibit is going to feature so many of the creators during that time period. It is a huge museum, and there are so many different exhibits within that museum, and this is located in DC. But one of those exhibits is the Harlem Renaissance, and they give such a detailed visual. I'm making a plan next year. I'm going to go visit myself. I can't wait. But they have a visual exhibit that really lets children and families and educators understand the global impact of the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, let's keep growing. Now, the next resource is going to be PBS Learning Media. They have a Harlem Renaissance activity and video guide. And so PBS Learning Media offers short, engaging videos that introduce kids to the Harlem Renaissance in a way that is easy to understand and visually rich. Their child-friendly clips explain who lived in Harlem and why this movement mattered and how it played a huge role in music, poetry, and even movies as we know them today. So this is a good beginner, right? Beginner guide. The next resource is going to be the Kennedy Center Drop Me Off in Harlem interactive experience. So the Kennedy Center created a fun, clickable website where kids can explore music, fashion, poetry, dance, and more from the Harlem Renaissance. Children can listen to jazz music, which they should, okay? They can meet famous artists and explore the culture room by room on this website. So if you can't get to DC quite yet, this is a good alternative, but I hope you get to DC, all right? So this is perfect for families who want hands-on ways to learn through play. It's also a good resource to have up, talk your child through page by page, kind of have the discussion around some of these different aspects, because I will say that, again, it's not as detailed as I want, which is the point of this Teacher Lady Speaks episode, to give you more insight. But I think so many of these websites are missing the current day impact. And for me, that is the most valuable aspect of the Harlem Renaissance. Let's keep growing. Next resource is called Brain Pop. They have a Harlem Renaissance lesson, and it's paired with a quiz. So for you educators who want to bring the Harlem Renaissance into your classroom, this is Black History Month. So this is a perfect opportunity to bring up those cultural impacts. Now, I do want to say that Black History Month is a way to celebrate the joys and the contributions of Black people, okay? This is not the month to talk about how Black people were enslaved. You can pick whatever other month out the year that you want to discuss that. But February and Black History Month has to shine light on the positive aspects of Black contributions. Now, you can talk about resistance in regards to being enslaved, but the focus should not be on us in this oppressive state, but more so cultural celebration. And so the Harlem Renaissance is a perfect thing to discuss and shine light on during Black History Month. And if you need more insight on how to discuss slavery and Black history for children, check out the very first week of the Teacher Lady Show, where we go over that as our topic. Let's keep growing. So Brain Pop. Brain Pop breaks the Harlem Renaissance down into short animated videos that introduce major figures like Louis Armstrong, Zora Neale Hurston, Billie Holiday. It includes quizzes, vocabulary games, and simple explanations that help kids connect the movement to courage, creativity, and cultural pride. Now, of course, if you want more resources and insights on how to teach your littles, you could even start at 4 years old, 5 years old, just starting to introduce what the Harlem Renaissance was, and then continue that study. But if you need more support, make sure you go to my website, scroll to the bottom, and add your email to my newsletter so that you can get all the extra goodies, okay? Let's move on to best practices. So, some best practices at home. 1, keep the discussion alive. Make sure that your child understands that their favorite artists likely got their influence from this era. Discuss it, talk about it, pick a book, read about it. I think so much of the Harlem Renaissance is not sitting down in one set lesson, but more so making it a part of that child's understanding. Because when that happens, when it just becomes a way of normal conversation, then they're able to better understand that impact and that influence. So really think about how many things in your house Just based on this Teacher Lady Speaks episode, how many things in your home or your day-to-day life could possibly be traced back to the Harlem Renaissance? Maybe our rights to vote, maybe having access to safe housing, maybe the way in which you have ideas around shadows and drawing, or music and musical influences. Really, the best practice is to uplift and to beautify the Harlem Renaissance and that era by making it part of these day-to-day acknowledgments, because that is the real impact. It's one thing to do something at that time period and then that's it, which also would have been beautiful. Would have been beautiful to have all these awesome artists come out during this time and then boom, that's the end of it. But for the rest of eternity, and I mean that, okay, so much can be connected back. That period was a way to tell Black people that there is so much more for you, that you are so valuable, you are creative, and you are seen. And there is so much power in that. So the best practice is to bring it up, to keep the Harlem Renaissance alive, to read it about different people, and to make sure that your children understand that a lot of the life that they know today is a result of the brave and brilliant and artistic individuals that came before them. Let's keep growing. Common questions. So one question is the Harlem Renaissance too mature for young kids? Absolutely not. Okay. The Harlem Renaissance in and of itself was a booming period for Black artists who came together to create something that completely changed the world. You don't have to share every single bit of the Harlem Renaissance with every age of child, right? And so if your child is 3, you might focus more on music. As your child becomes a high schooler, a middle schooler, you can talk about more of the laws that they were trying to change, like legal lynchings. And so you want to make sure with all of this, you curate those discussions in a way that meets the developmental needs of your child as well as the age group of your child. Let's keep growing. The next question is, do I need to explain racism? Absolutely. Racism is a part of American history. It's something that a lot of people still experience, and it's something that was experienced in an even more overt way at this time. So unfortunately, it is a pain point, and it is one that still needs to be discussed. It is one that children and people need to understand, because it has not just disappeared. Let's keep growing. And the last question is, how does art really relate to history? Now, if you've gotten through this entire Teacher Lady Speaks episode and you cannot answer that, then I didn't do my job very well. Overall, art is what was able to pass the messages of what was taking place at that time in terms of our history. It was a way to continue those messages, to keep that hope alive, and to truly fight for what it is we were looking for, which was equality. And so I believe that this episode is definitely going to help you to be able to fully answer that question, but hopefully it was able to get it to you in a few quick sentences. Wow. I know that was a mouthful. Thank you for learning with me, for growing with me, for being willing to explore this super vibrant, magical period. Okay, I really appreciate you taking the time. I hope that you take this information and you share it in your classroom, you share it in your community. Happy Black History Month. Thank you for learning with me, for growing with me, and for being part of this book-loving community. I do want to take the time to tell you that I am also an author and illustrator, and I know that my writing was heavily influenced by this period as well. And I encourage you to check out my diverse line of children's books. But those books also led to something called the Empathy Library, which is a pay-it-forward initiative to get books to children in need on purpose. Okay, so we give intentional libraries to children depending on their identity and their reading levels, and that is all by way of your generosity. So go onto the website, scroll down, look for the Empathy Library, donate what you can, do what you can when you can. And until next time, remember to enjoy the moment, or go be a joy in the moment. Bye.